In the early hours of June 22nd, 1941, the Soviet Union's western border begins to fail faster than almost anyone expected. German aircraft strike airfields, rail junctions, and command posts in coordinated ways. Border units are hit from multiple directions before they can fully deploy. Communications collapse almost immediately. By mid-morning, German armored columns are already moving east through gaps torn open in the frontier defenses. This is Operation Barbarossa, and in the south, its opening phase unfolds with terrifying speed. German Army Group South is pushing into Ukraine, and at its tip is Panzer Group 1, a mobile formation designed not to seek decisive battles near the border, but to break through, bypass resistance, and keep moving before the Red Army can reorganize. For the first day, that design works almost perfectly. But while the border armies are being smashed, the war is not yet decided behind them. In western Ukraine, the Soviet Southwestern Front still controls large mechanized forces, units that have not yet been destroyed, surrounded, or forced to retreat. And before the first day of the invasion is even over, Soviet commanders are faced with a decision that will define the next week of fighting. Do they continue falling back, creating space for time? Or do they attempt something far more dangerous, launching a massive armored counterattack almost immediately before the German spearhead can fully stabilize? The place where that decision will play out lies between three towns most people have never heard of: Lutsk, Dubno, and Brody. To understand why the Soviets choose to fight there, it's important to understand what the Germans are trying to achieve in the opening days of Barbarossa. Panzer Group 1 is not supposed to win a dramatic tank battle near the frontier. Its job is to move fast enough that the Red Army never has time to recover its ground. German doctrine emphasizes tempo, pushing armored units deep, forcing the enemy to react late with incomplete information and a fractured command. Every kilometer gained in the first days makes the Soviet response harder. If German armored units can push far enough east, infantry divisions will follow, securing flanks and supply runs. Once that happens, any Soviet counterattack will hit a much more stable, layered defense. From the German perspective, the most dangerous moment of the campaign is right now. While their armored spearheads are extended, moving on limited road networks and dependent on long supply lines that trail behind them. That vulnerability is exactly what the Soviets are looking at. For the Soviets, the first day of Barbarossa is chaotic, but it isn't hopeless. The border armies are being torn apart, communications are failing, Luftwaffe air support is immediately apparent. But behind the collapsing frontier, the Southwestern Front still has access to large mechanized formations positioned within striking distance of the German advance. These aren't small units either. On paper, they represent one of the largest armored concentrations anywhere in Europe in 1941. Multiple mechanized corps, each with hundreds of tanks, are located north and south of the German penetration zone. Among them are significant numbers of new P-34 and KV tanks, vehicles whose armor and firepower far exceed what many German units are prepared to face at this stage of the war. Soviet commanders understand that these forces represent a fleeting opportunity. If Panzer Group 1 is allowed to advance for several more days, its spearhead will no longer be vulnerable. Infantry divisions will secure the flank. Supply lines will shorten. German command posts will settle into more permanent positions. But right now, the German advance is stretched, moving quickly through unfamiliar terrain, reliant on a limited number of roads. This is a moment when a counterattack, if one is ever going to work, must be launched. The Soviet counterattack isn't aimed randomly either. It's focused on a specific geographic problem. The region between Lutsk, Dubno, and Brody is a transport hub. Roads from the border converge here before branching deeper into Ukraine. Rivers and crossings funnel movement. Fuel convoys, ammunition columns, and command traffic must pass through this area. If Soviet armored forces can strike into this region, especially from more than one direction, they can threaten the base of the German penetration, not just the leading elements at the front. This is a critical distinction. Meeting the Germans head-on would mean fighting their strongest units directly. Striking the base of the penetration means attacking the system that keeps those units alive and moving. This is the logic behind the Soviet plan. Mechanized corps positioned north and south of the German advance are to move toward Dubno and strike inward, forming a converging counterattack. If successful, this could cut German supply routes, isolate forward units, and force Panzer Group 1 to halt or even withdraw. It is an operational gamble. The plan depends on timing. The attacks must land close enough together that German units cannot shift forces from one threatened sector to another. If the counterattack arrives in pieces, the Germans will have time to respond, concentrate firepower, and defeat each thrust separately. This is where the danger lies. Because the Red Army in June 1941 is not a finely tuned machine. Its mechanized corps are large but unwieldy. Communications are fragile. Logistics are uneven. And now everything is happening under constant air attack. Despite these problems, Soviet commanders conclude that waiting is far more dangerous than action. The pressure to counterattack does not only come from the front, it comes from Moscow as well. The belief, shared by much of the Soviet high command, is that aggressive action can disrupt German momentum and prevent the kind of deep encirclements that destroyed Soviet forces in the opening days of previous campaigns. The order that emerges on June 22nd is clear in its intent, if not in its execution. The mechanized corps will attack as soon as they can move into position. This is not a carefully staged operation. It's a decision made under shock, with incomplete information, and with the knowledge that the opportunity window is closing by the hour. As Soviet mechanized units begin moving toward their attack area, the battlefield immediately imposes its own rules. Roads clogged with refugees fleeing west and retreating units moving east. Luftwaffe aircraft strike columns, bridges, and junctions. Vehicles break down under the strain of continuous movement. Fuel and ammunition trucks fall behind. Radio contact between units becomes intermittent or disappears. Some tank divisions reach the battle area without infantry support. Others arrive short on fuel. Timetables slip, not by minutes, but by hours and days. This matters because the Soviet plan depends on coordination. A converging counterattack only works if its blows land together. Every delay increases the chance that German commanders will see the threat coming and react in time. And the Germans are already reacting. German reconnaissance reports quickly identify large Soviet armored movements on the flanks of the advance. This did not surprise German commanders, but the scale of the movement begins to register. From the German perspective, this confirms their most immediate concern. The Soviets are attempting to strike the penetration before it can stabilize. The German response is not to stop advancing entirely, but to remain flexible. Units are ordered to secure key junctions. Anti-tank and artillery elements are repositioned. Infantry divisions are urged forward to protect supply routes. The goal is not to destroy every Soviet tank immediately, but to prevent a coordinated blow from landing at once. When Soviet armored units finally begin making contact with German forces in strength, the fighting immediately reveals something new. German crews encounter T-34s and KV tanks in numbers large enough to matter. Standard anti-tank weapons struggle. Shots that would normally disable a tank's strike armor and fail to penetrate. For German units accustomed to rapid victories in Poland and France, this is unsettling. But by itself, it's not decisive. A heavy tank can dominate a local fight. It cannot exploit a breakthrough or hold territory without fuel, ammunition, and coordination. And those are precisely the things the Soviet system is struggling to deliver. This contradiction between tactical power and operation fragility will define the Battle of Brody. By the end of June 22nd, the situation is set. Panzer Group 1 is advancing rapidly into western Ukraine, but its flanks and supply routes are exposed. The Soviet Southwestern Front has chosen to fight, not later, not after full reorganization, but immediately, by committing massive mechanized forces into a risky counterattack aimed at the base of the German advance. The counterattack has not yet landed, but it is coming. And by the morning of June 23rd, 1941, the counterattack exists. But the problem is it exists mainly on paper. Across western Ukraine, Soviet mechanized corps are moving toward their assigned axes, engines running, columns stretching for kilometers along narrow roads. Orders are being issued, revised, and reissued as reports arrive late or not at all. Commanders are trying to align formations that are already in motion, already under air attack, already burning fuel faster than it can be replaced. At the same time, German armored units are still advancing. The two movements, one offensive, one counteroffensive, are now racing toward the same ground. On June 23rd, Soviet mechanized corps begin moving in earnest toward the Brody-Dubno area. From the north, formations under the 5th Army move south. From the south, units under the 6th Army begin moving north. The intent is convergent, but almost immediately, the gap between intent and execution becomes clear. Many Soviet units are moving long distances from peacetime locations. Tank columns advance without full infantry screens. Mule trucks struggle to keep up. Air attacks disrupt road traffic, forcing halts and detours. Bridges are damaged or destroyed before engineers can secure them. What was supposed to be a synchronized movement begins to stretch and fray. This is not defeat, but it is delay. And at this stage, delay may matter more than firepower itself. Every hour the Soviet counterattack slips is an hour the Germans use to adapt. Panzer Group 1 does not stop advancing on June 23rd, but its commanders begin adjusting their posture. Reconnaissance units report Soviet armored movement on the flank. Road security becomes a priority. Anti-tank assets are pushed forward. Infantry divisions are urged to close up behind the spearhead. The Germans are not panicking, but they are no longer assuming the road ahead is empty. This is where tempo becomes decisive. A counterattack that arrives late is not just weaker. It arrives against an enemy that has already shifted to meet it. German armored columns continue moving east, often bypassing resistance rather than engaging it head-on. The German method at this stage is deliberate. Panzer units probe forward, seize junctions, and maintain freedom of maneuver. Infantry follows closely enough to secure terrain, but not so closely that it slows the advance. When contact occurs, German units seek to fix Soviet forces in places where maneuver elements continue forward. The goal is not annihilation, it is continuity of movement. This is how Panzer Group 1 creates problems faster than the Soviet command can solve them. By late June 23rd and into June 24th, Soviet armored units begin making contact with German forces in growing numbers. These encounters are uneven. In some areas, Soviet tanks strike German screening units and achieve local success. German anti-tank guns struggle against the heavier Soviet machines. Crews are forced to disengage or call for heavier weapons. In other areas, however, Soviet units run directly into prepared German defenses or are caught while still assembling. Without infantry support, tanks are forced to fight blind, unable to clear villages, forests, or anti-tank positions effectively. The result is a battlefield filled with local victories that fail to connect. Soviet armor can punch, but it struggles to hold. For the men inside the tanks, this phase of battle is disorienting. A column moves, halts, moves again. Orders arrive late. The radio crackles and goes silent. The road ahead is clogged with burned vehicles or cratered by bombs. Luftwaffe aircraft appear overhead with little warning. A crew fights, pulls back, refuels from cans, then fights again. By nightfall, they are unsure where friendly units are supposed to be. The map no longer matches the terrain, landmarks are gone or burning. This is not yet a collapse, but it is exhaustion setting in early. By June 24th, the central problem of the Soviet counterattack is no longer lack of supply, coordination. Some mechanized corps have already fought hard engagement. Others are still arriving. Attacks that were supposed to land simultaneously instead strike hours or even days apart. German commanders exploit this relentlessly. When Soviet units attack in isolation, German forces concentrate against them. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and infantry are brought forward. Mobile reserves are shifted to threaten sectors. Once the immediate danger is neutralized, German units resume their attack. This is how a numerically inferior force survives against the larger, by never allowing the larger force to hit all at once. At the operational level, these responses are shaped by General Ewald von Kleist, commanding Panzer Group 1. Kleist's task is not to destroy the entire Soviet armored reserve. That would be unrealistic. His task is simpler and more achievable. Prevent the counterattack from becoming operationally decisive. That means holding key road hubs, keeping supply routes open, and ensuring that Soviet thrusts do not cut deeply to force a halt. German forces can't accept tactical losses as long as momentum is preserved. And by the evening of June 24th, the battle has taken on its defining character. Soviet mechanized forces are committed in strength, but not in unity. German armored forces are still advancing, but under constant pressure. The battlefield is fragmented into dozens of overlapping fights over roads, villages, and crossings. Dubno is beginning to emerge as a central prize, not yet because it has been seized, but because everything now seems to move toward it. The Soviet counterattack is no longer hypothetical, but it has not yet landed a decisive blow. And by the end of June 24th, both sides understood what kind of battle this would be coming. The Soviets know they must strike deeper toward Dubno itself if they are going to disrupt the German advance in a meaningful way. The Germans know they must prevent that penetration from stabilizing at all costs. On June 25th, Soviet mechanized corps intensify their attacks along the German advance corridor. These are no longer probing actions, they are full-scale armored engagement with hundreds of tanks committed across multiple axes. In several sectors, German forward units are forced to halt, regroup, or pull back short distances as Soviet armor punches through screening elements. For the first time since the invasion began, Panzer Group 1 is being forced to fight while moving, rather than simply advance. This pressure is uneven. Some Soviet units attack with real weight and coordination. Others arrive late, under strength, or without infantry and artillery support. The result is a battlefield where German units experience sudden crises followed by rapid relief once Soviet thrusts lose momentum. From the Soviet perspective, the battle feels close to tipping. From the German perspective, it feels dangerous but manageable. At Southwestern Front headquarters, Mikhail Karponos is now operating under extreme strain. Reports from the front are contradictory. Some units report breakthroughs, others report heavy losses. Communications are unreliable. Air attacks continue to disrupt movement in command posts. Karponos understands the stakes clearly. If the counterattack fails to achieve a decisive operational result soon, the Red Army risks losing its mechanized reserve in a series of costly but inconclusive battles. Yet he also understands that pulling back now would leave Panzer Group 1 free to continue its advance unchecked. This is the trap of early Barbarossa for Soviet commanders. Action risks destruction, inaction guarantees it. That dilemma is intensified by pressure from Moscow. The Soviet High Command expects the mechanized corps to strike hard and immediately. The belief remains that German armored spearheads are vulnerable if hit with sufficient mass. Figures like Zhukov embody that pressure. The expectation from above is not merely resistance, but counteroffensive action, proof that the Red Army is not collapsing everywhere at once. This pressure compresses timelines even further. There is little tolerance for delay or consolidation. As a result, Soviet attacks continue to go in as soon as units arrive, rather than waiting for full synchronization. By June 26th, the shape of the battle tightens further. German forces are still advancing east, but the fighting increasingly clusters around Dubno and the surrounding road network. Soviet units begin pushing deeper toward the hub, aiming not just to hit German forward elements, but to disrupt the flow of fuel, ammunition, and command traffic behind them. This is the Soviet counterattack reaching for its true objective. In several engagements, Soviet armor achieves genuine tactical success. German units are caught on the move, supply columns are threatened, anti-tank defenses are overwhelmed by the sheer presence of tanks. For the first time, German commanders face the real possibility that elements of Panzer Group 1 could be cut off, not temporarily delayed. But the same problem persists. These thrusts arrive piecemeal. A tank regiment breaks through, but its neighboring unit is hours behind. Infantry fails to keep pace. Artillery cannot be brought forward in time. Fuel shortages begin to bite. What should be a widening corridor becomes a narrow sphere. This is where Brody stops looking like a map exercise and starts looking like a wreckage field. A tank advances, fires, pushes through resistance, and then stops because fuel trucks never arrive. Another is abandoned because of mechanical failure. Others are knocked out not by frontal fire, but because they are forced to fight alone against prepared positions. The battlefield fills with burned vehicles, scattered equipment, and half-finished fights. The Soviets are not being defeated because they refuse to fight. They are being defeated because fighting faster than your system can support is still defeat. However, on June 27th, the Soviet counterattack produces its most dangerous moment for the German advance. A powerful Soviet armored thrust breaks through toward Dubno itself, penetrating deep into the German rear. Roads that were assumed safe are suddenly under threat. Supply convoys are disrupted. Command traffic is forced to reroute or halt. For a brief window, the German advance in this sector is genuinely at risk. This is what the Soviet plan was meant to achieve. If the penetration can be reinforced, if fuel and ammunition can be pushed through, it could force Panzer Group 1 to stop and reorganize under pressure. But once again, the same constraints assert themselves. The breakthrough moves faster than its support. Communications falter. The thrust narrows. German commanders begin shifting forces inward rather than forward. The Germans are no longer reacting blindly. They are containing. German units respond to this breakthrough, not by attempting to annihilate it, but by isolating it. Heavier guns are brought forward. Anti-aircraft weapons are used in direct fire roles. Infantry moves to secure junctions behind the penetration, cutting it off from reinforcement. The German system does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be faster than the Soviet ability to sustain the breakthrough. And it is. A German operational assessment from these days captured the emerging pattern. Soviet armored forces achieved repeated local penetrations, but were unable to exploit them operationally. That single sentence explains why Brody becomes what it becomes. By the end of June 27th, the Battle of Brody has reached its hinge. The Soviets have achieved what they set out to do tactically. They have broken into the German rear and forced Panzer Group 1 to fight for its own supply. But they have not achieved what they needed operationally, a stable, widening penetration that could not be sealed. The German response is now shifting from reaction to reduction. On June 28th, the Battle of Brody reaches a quiet but decisive line. The Soviets are no longer trying to create a breakthrough. They are trying to keep this one alive. German armored units are no longer worried about being surprised. They are worried about closing doors fast enough, sealing penetrations, cutting supply routes, and preventing isolated Soviet forces from linking up into something larger. What follows is not a dramatic rout. It is a methodical suffocation. On the morning of June 28th, German commanders assessed the situation around Dubno and reached the same conclusion independently. The Soviet counterattack has failed to synchronize. This does not mean it has failed to fight. German units have taken losses, movements have been disrupted, supply columns have been threatened, but the Soviets have not achieved the continuous corridor into the German rear. This gives Germany an opening. German mobile formations begin pivoting inward. Infantry divisions are rushed forward to hold ground that armored units previously bypassed. Reconnaissance flights identify Soviet concentrations and movement. The goal is no longer speed. The goal is containment. The German method here is deliberate and disciplined. They do not attempt to crush Soviet armor head-on everywhere at once. Instead, they identify the edges of the penetration, where Soviet units are most exposed and most dependent on a few roads for fuel and ammunition. Those roads become targets. Bridges are shelled or seized. Junctions are blocked by infantry and anti-tank guns. Artillery is positioned to cover likely breakout routes. A Soviet tank regiment may still be powerful in front of it, but behind it, the ground is being quietly taken away. Inside the Soviet thrust, the problem becomes brutally simple. Fuel runs low, ammunition dwindles, radios fail. Units that fought hard on the 26th and 27th now find themselves unable to maneuver. Tanks that should be attacking are sitting idle under camouflage, engines shut down to conserve fuel. And this is where even the most formidable machines reveal their limits. A T-34 without fuel is not a spear. A KV without ammunition is not a breakthrough weapon. They become static points in a moving war. By this point, many Soviet tanks are not destroyed in combat. They are left behind because they can no longer move, cannot be repaired, or cannot be supplied. Throughout the rest of the day on the 28th, Soviet units attempt to reopen corridors toward Dubno and beyond. Some attacks are determined and well led. Heavy tanks push through villages and roadblocks. German infantry is forced to scatter or fall back. In isolated moments, Soviet armor still looks terrifying. But each of these attacks run into the same wall. Without sustained artillery support, without infantry to clear flanks, and without secure supply lines behind them, Soviet thrusts burn out after hours instead of days. The Germans absorb the impact, shift firepower, and then close in again. This is the turning point of the battle. Not because the Soviets stop attacking, but because the attacks stop changing the situation. By June 29th, Soviet commanders commit some of their heaviest remaining assets in an effort to break the containment. Among them are KV-2 heavy tanks, massive vehicles armed with 152mm guns designed to smash fortified positions. On paper, these machines are monsters. Their shells can tear apart buildings, bunkers, and gun positions with a single hit. When they appear, German units feel it. But Brody is not a siege. The KV-2s arrive late, on narrow roads, often without proper reconnaissance or infantry support. Their slow speed and enormous silhouettes make them vulnerable to artillery, air attack, and concentrated fire once their positions are identified. By the end of June 29th, the battlefield around Brody is littered with evidence of how the counterattack has failed. Burned tanks mark roads that were supposed to be supply routes. Abandoned vehicles still intact but empty. Units that were meant to strike together are now separated by German-held ground. German forces are no longer improvising. They are reducing. Soviet formations, on the other hand, are no longer maneuvering. They are surviving. And by the night of June 29th, the outcome of the Battle of Brody is no longer in doubt. The Soviet counterattack has definitively failed to achieve its operational objective. German forces have contained the penetration, cut the supply routes, and regained freedom of movement. What remains is not a breakthrough, but a series of isolated Soviet groups fighting their way out, abandoning equipment, or being destroyed where they stand. On June 30th, the Soviet Southwestern Front makes a critical decision. With mechanized corps shattered, fuel and ammunition stocks exhausted, and German forces regaining freedom of movement, continuing the counterattack risks something far worse than defeat: encirclement of the entire front. German bridgeheads and mobile forces are already probing deeper. The danger is no longer limited to the Dubno area. It threatens to unhinge Soviet armies across western Ukraine. So Kirponos orders a withdrawal to a new defensive line further east. This decision was not a retreat caused by panic. It was a recognition that the counterattack has failed to stop the Germans, and that preserving what remains now matters more than holding ground. For many Soviet units, this withdrawal is brutal. Without vehicles, without clear routes, and under constant air and ground pressure, thousands of men retreat on foot. Tanks that cannot move are destroyed or abandoned. Entire mechanized formation cease to exist as coherent units. The battle that began as a gamble to disrupt the German advance ended up a fight to avoid annihilation. From the German perspective, Brody is a costly success. Panzer Group 1 is delayed. Units take losses. German commanders are forced to divert effort into containment instead of pure advance. The fighting is far harder than anything encountered in Poland or France. But strategically, the outcome favors Germany. The Soviet mechanized reserve in this sector, which was once one of the largest concentrations of armor the Red Army possessed, numbering almost 3,000 tanks, has been burned away in a single week. Thousands of tanks are destroyed, abandoned, or rendered unusable. Survivors retreat without the equipment needed to mount another large counteroffensive. Most importantly, Panzer Group 1 emerges with its advance intact. It has survived the most dangerous moment of the Southern campaign and can now resume movement eastward with reduced risk of a similar counterattack. For the Red Army, Brody is catastrophic in material losses. Multiple mechanized corps are shattered. Tank losses are enormous. Command cohesion collapses at critical moments. The counterattack fails. But Brody is also a lesson written in fire. It proves that numbers alone are not enough, that modern tanks, no matter how powerful, cannot substitute for logistics, communication, infantry coordination, and air defense. It exposes the limits of Soviet pre-war mechanized doctrine, formation that look terrifying on paper but cannot sustain deep operations under pressure. And it teaches something else as well. Germany is not invincible. Time and time again, Soviet tanks shock German units. German anti-tank weapons fail. German formations are forced to adapt on the fly. The Germans survive not because they are immune, but because their system absorbs shocks faster. This distinction will matter later in the war. When the fighting fades, the landscape tells the story more clearly than any report. Roads are lined with wrecks, tanks sit abandoned where fuel ran out, fields are torn by tracks and shell craters. Villages that briefly became objectives return to being landmarks. The scale of destruction is immense, but it is not the destruction of a single climactic battle. It is the cost of hundreds of disconnected fights, each one burning a little more of the Red Army's strength. This is Brody's true ending. Not a victory parade, not a dramatic encirclement, but the silent aftermath of a mechanized force expended faster than it could be sustained. Some mechanized corps ceased to exist as effective formations entirely. The Battle of Brody does not stop Barbarossa. Panzer Group 1 continues east. The campaign in Ukraine rolls on toward Kiev, the Dnieper, and eventually the catastrophic encirclements of the summer and fall. But Brody matters because it reveals the shape of the war before it becomes famous. It shows the Red Army trying to fight modern mechanized war without the systems needed to sustain it. It shows German forces learning very early that Soviet armor is dangerous, numerous, and improving rapidly. And it shows that in 1941, speed, coordination, and logistics matter more than raw numbers. Brody is not a footnote. It is the prototype of the Eastern Front's armored war. Huge, chaotic, brutal, and decided as much by fuel trucks and radios as by guns and armor.